Good evening. On behalf of Columbia University's Institute for Latin American Studies, the Cuba program welcomes you to this evening's webinar entitled Cuba Update. Because of strong interest in current conditions in Cuba, we have expanded the topic beyond migration, which of course is a major topic. And we are going to discuss this evening, not only immigration, but also economic and social conditions within Cuba, US-Cuban relations, protests, energy, and probably a couple other items. So we welcome you to this roundtable. Rather than having formal presentations, we're going to have a roundtable discussion amongst our speakers. And our speakers this evening are Philip Brenner, Emeritus Professor at the School of International Service of American University, William LeoGrande, who is a professor of government also at American University in Washington, D.C. Gretchen Sanchez, a former TV journalist and reporter from Havana, Cuba, who is currently working in the legal realm on migration. In addition, I will be joining the speakers, and I am the director of the Cuba program at Columbia University, and also a Cuba specialist, along with Bill, Gretchen, and Leigh Edmonds, who is the new assistant to the Cuba program at Columbia University. And her claim to fame is she's doing 2 master's degrees, one at NYU and one at Columbia University. And we get what little free time she has left. If you have questions, we would ask you to put them in the chat room, not the Q&A, and we will collect those questions and present them to our panelists, and our panelists can all respond to whatever question there is. This will save time. It will also help reduce duplication, we hope, etc. So we also, I want to mention very, very briefly that in November 8th, the marine biologist David Guggenheim, who is also an award-winning photographer and has worked in and around Cuba for a couple decades, will be presenting his documentary about the marine ecosystems that are adjacent to Cuba. And this will be the first showing of his forthcoming documentary about Cuba and its reefs and its marine life, etc. So that's going to be a very special thing. Before it goes on PBS, we will see it first. And in December 6th, we will have Jorge Piñon, who's a senior fellow at the Energy Institute at the University of Texas at Austin, who has spent 40 years tracking energy issues worldwide, speaking about the current energy situation in Cuba. And he will be accompanied by Ricardo Torres, who's currently a visiting professor at American University and formerly was a professor at the University of Havana and is a specialist on the Cuban economy. So that is not only our agenda for tonight, but our agenda for the rest of the semester. And now we would like to move to a series of questions that were devised by our panelists. And the first question I'm going to ask Phil Brenner, Professor Brenner from American University about a record number of Cuban migrants who have attempted to enter the United States in the last 6 months. What are the current numbers? What are the main factors propelling this new migration? And he will be joined at the end of his comments by Gretchen Sanchez concerning migration. So Phil, Phil, I'm already confused. Phil Brenner, please. Migration.
Thank you very much, Meg. The audience should know that Meg is not just a Cuba scholar, but she is in many ways the dean of Cuban scholars in the United States. She has generated many students. She has taken on this task of tirelessly having a series of webinars about Cuba that a large audience has been grateful for. So thank you very much, Meg. So let me begin answering your question by sharing my screen, giving you some sense of the enormity of Cuban migration. In the federal government measures this by fiscal years, and the fiscal year ends actually on September 30th. The data for September isn't available, but as of the end of August, the Cuban migration to the United States is nearly 200,000. If you compare that to last year, where it was about 40,000, the year before, about 10,000, and to the major exoduses, the Mariel boat lift in 1980 and the Balsero crisis of 1994, you can see that this is an unprecedented migration from Cuba. And to give you further sense of that, if you take a look at the Cuban migration in comparison to some other countries, Mexico remains the largest source of migrants to the United States, but Mexico, the numbers for Mexico are a little bit inflated because these are border encounters. So a border encounter measures not only when someone crosses the border, but it measures people being turned back. And in the case of Cubans, people don't try again. In the case of Mexicans, many of them come more than one time, so that the number is inflated by the repeats. That's somewhat true of migrants from Honduras and Nicaragua too, but you can see that those numbers have increased significantly as well. Cuba is very high for Cuba. And so what explains this enormous increase in migration? Well, I'd say there are three factors if we take a broad view. The first is the Cuban economy. And we'll talk more about the Cuban economy later, I think, but give you a general sense. Since January of 2021, the Cuban economy has taken a turn for the worse in the sense that at that moment, the Cuban government unified its currency, which there had been a hard currency they called the CUC and the local currency, the peso. And the peso was to some extent supported by the government in ways that was unnatural. And so the unification of the currency led to an enormous inflation. That combined with the loss of tourism. Cuba shut down its tourist economy because of the coronavirus pandemic. And at the same time, the United States had cut off essentially travel to Cuba, mainly through the cruise ships, people-to-people travel. And so even when Cuba reopened its doors to tourism at the end of 2021, the large number of Americans who had come there before still were not coming. So there was inflation, loss of jobs, loss of opportunities, and the there was not enough food. Cuba imports 70% of its food, and with the loss of hard currency, it had trouble importing a sufficient amount of food as well as a sufficient amount of oil. And that meant there were blackouts. And so there's been a perfect storm for Cuba in terms of its economy failing. The second factor is that in the past, Cubans had more difficulty traveling abroad. Cubans now have access to passports and can leave the country. They have to be able to go to a country that will allow them in, but that has been, they have been able to go to Nicaragua, for example. And so Cubans leaving the country has made it easier for them to migrate. The third factor is in some ways the most troubling, and that is young people have lost hope in the future. And that loss of hope, that sense that they, no matter what is going to happen, that there's not going to be a place for them, I think has contributed to this circumstance. And so the circumstance that we find the Cubans in now is one that's in some ways harkens back to the very early days of the 1960s when there was a large exodus of Cubans, and it may speak to something about the future. Let Gretchen talk about that, since she's very much involved with Cuban migrants now.
Thank you, Phil. First of all, I think I have to thank Meg. I consider myself a mentoree, although Meg has never been my former professor. But thank you, Meg, for inviting me. Yeah, so let's start with I think walking people through what's the journey of Cubans coming to the US and where does it start? For sure, it starts in Cuba, but it starts gathering the money, hard currency. We are talking about dollars. We are talking about people who are selling everything they have to get dollars in the black market in Cuba. As of now, a dollar accounts for more than 200 Cuban pesos, and it's even higher than euros or any other hard currency. Cubans have to gather between $7,000 to $10,000 per person to come to the US. That means that, for example, if they are doing a journey through Nicaragua, they have to set aside $3,000 only for a ticket in the black market to go to Managua. And from Managua, the journey starts. It starts and it costs between $5,000 to $7,000 per person again. And this is like, if you are a family of 4, you are basically selling all you have gathered and you have in life just to come to the US, because a house in Cuba doesn't sell for that much, honestly. So the journey starts there. Why now we are seeing these increased numbers? If we go back to, like, for example, July 2021, we saw that Cuba was under one of the biggest outbreaks of COVID, especially in Matanzas with the Delta variant. And that accounted for many people very sick and still struggling with their lives, with their own health. So Cubans, as of like last year, a little over 12 months couldn't leave the island because still there was a lot of restrictions to fly, even though the ones who could made it did it and came to the US. But still there were a lot of people who were struggling with their own lives. So then we go to basically the beginning of this year. Flights and restrictions have relaxed. Cubans can travel to Nicaragua without a visa, without needing a tourist visa. But there are other Cubans whose journeys start from all over South America. Some people come from Venezuela and they basically break their Cuban official, the official contract to come to the US. And that's where they encounter very, very dangerous places like the Darien Gap, the Darien Jungle, where they basically risk extremely their lives. They are extortioned. They have to pay around $100 to indigenous tribes just to go through the Darien Gap. Women suffer rape. They have to basically encounter extraneous hikings and climbings just to go through the Darien Gap and go through the jungle. And they also have to survive the very dangerous and inhospitable environment. They have to survive poison snakes. They have to survive all kinds of things, and doing it by walking 60 miles through the Darien Gap. And then they make it some of them have died. We have to start by then. This is not something that is 100% safe for anyone, nor for Cubans either. They drowned, they have died in the Darien forest, they have suffered a lot of things. They have died from poison snakes, they have died from a disease. So then they come to the border, and they are basically located in two groups. Those who are the lucky ones and get a humanitarian parole, a 212 D5, and can adjust status in a year, and those who can't, those who are the not lucky ones and are released with an order of release on recognizance and have to go through an immigration process. Those Cubans have to gather money that they don't have, that they didn't come with, and pay attorneys between $7,000 and $12,000 just to go through the whole process. And they don't know when they come to the US that they cannot adjust status through the Cuban Adjustment Act. So basically that's the journey that they have to do. As of now, the city of Miami and Florida is overwhelmed with Cubans who are looking desperately for a job to pay for their basic needs, and they don't find anything, not even in construction. That time before was an easy place to find a job, not even in the service area, restaurants or making food. So these Cubans the city of Miami is completely overwhelmed. There are families who are receiving at once 7 Cubans, 15 Cubans, who knows how many, and not even having the resources, the financial resources to host that amount of people. Then we have Cubans who basically, a whole social system that it's receiving and providing for many Cubans. We have basically all the Cubans who are coming, or I don't want to generalize, but a lot of them are receiving food stamps, are receiving money in credit card, in debit cards, $300 per month. Cubans are receiving Medicaid, and that's a lot of resources just located for them. So basically, yeah, I'm not going to continue because it's a lot, and we'll leave it there. Thank you.
We'll move now. Phil mentioned one of the motives, obviously, for increased migration has been the socioeconomic conditions in Cuba. I'd like to ask Bill, what is the current situation of the Cuban economy with severe inflation this past year and a half? What is causing the inflation? What impact is it having on the population? And what is the government of Cuba doing about it? Bill?
Thanks, Meg, and thanks for having us this evening. So Phil started out with a good foundation for this. First of all, the Cuban economy has suffered a series of really major blows over the last couple of years. Trump sanctions, which cut down travel to almost nothing from the United States, cut off wire service remittances, convinced a number of conservative governments in Latin America to break their contracts for medical services with Cuba. And then, of course, COVID shut down the tourist industry for more than a year. So Cuba is suffering a very severe shortage of foreign exchange currency. And as Phil said, that means that they don't have the money to import even basic necessities like food, medicine, and fuel. The Cuban government's capacity to import fell 40% last year, which is just an enormous decline in their ability to provide very basic things. And that's the cause of a lot of the shortages. And it's also partly the cause of the electrical blackouts that Cuba's been suffering. But the inflation comes essentially from, as Phil said, the unification of exchange rates and the dual currency in January of 2021. That led to a devaluation of the Cuban peso, which everybody expected, and the government raised wages proportionately to hopefully insulate the general population from the impact of that. But it touched off broader inflation, which has far exceeded the increases in people's wages. And that's caused by a couple of different things together. First, there's a number of state firms whose bottom line was hurt by the devaluation of the currency. And rather than sort of streamlining themselves, becoming more efficient to maintain their net revenue, what they did instead was just raise prices on people. Secondly, the government has been sustaining a huge fiscal deficit over the last couple of years. Partly that's the result of COVID, and partly it's a result of state firms that are losing money being subsidized by the government's budget rather than the alternative of closing them and putting large numbers of people out of work. The result is lower productivity, which means fewer goods to export, which means less hard currency that the government is earning. And another issue is that there's right now a very high demand for US dollars. People see the dollar as a haven of stability as the Cuban peso has continued to deteriorate in terms of its value. And as Gretchen was explaining, people are trying to accumulate dollars in order to be able to finance migration. And finally, you need dollars or some other hard currency to buy many goods in the dollar stores, which are called MLC stores, hard currency stores. And lastly, there's a shortage of US dollars because of US sanctions. The cutoff of remittances, the slow recovery of tourism, the international financial sanctions that prevent international banks from doing business with Cuba. All of these things are contributing to the really, really difficult economic conditions that Cubans are living with today. In the short term, there's not a lot the government can really do about it. In the longer term, it's a matter of raising productivity, getting the fiscal deficit under control, expanding exports, reducing imports, and earning more hard currency. But that's not something that you can look at even in 3, 6, 9 months. Now, if remittances resume and if travel recovers finally after the pandemic, that'll give the government a little bit of breathing space. But there are much more profound economic changes that need to happen in order to solve this in a long-term structural way.
Bill, let me follow up by asking about the ways in which the Cuban people have responded to this. There have been demonstrations. There's recently, is in response to the way the government has handled the blackouts coming from the Matanzas refinery fires and now the consequences of Hurricane Ian, and the western part of Cuba, Pinar del Rio, has been quite devastated. 90,000 homes were lost because of the hurricane. And these criticisms and demonstrations even preceded these occurrences. In fact, in July of 2021, you edited a book about this. In July 2021, there were major demonstrations. Can you give us a sense of what the significance of the demonstrations then and the continuing demonstrations has been? How has the government dealt with this? What's the long-term sense of this, is this a growing civil society?
These demonstrations are really unprecedented in Cuba. As you say, really since the blackouts began across the island last April, there have been dozens of demonstrations all across Cuba, not large, mostly confined to local neighborhoods. So 100 people, 200 people. I think one of the largest was maybe 1,000 people. And they're spontaneous, and they're a protest about direct protests about loss of power, loss of water, which often depends upon power to pump it up to higher levels of a building. The loss of power, particularly when it's sort of unpredicted and lasts a long time, is really devastating for people, because it means that any perishable food that they have, which cost a lot of money and which they may have had to stand in line or search around the city to find, it deteriorates, it perishes. And so it's just enormously frustrating for people. So these demonstrations, as I say, largely spontaneous rather than being organized. And they've been largely peaceful. They have been demands for the government to be better and faster at restoring power, restoring the water, cleaning up after the hurricane. In that way, they're different from the demonstrations last July 11, or July 11, 2021, I mean, in that none of them have gone viral through social media, sparking similar demonstrations in other places. Each of these has been just a discrete event, but they are similar in the sense that I think that the broad participation in the July 11 demonstration, which actually started as a protest about electrical blackouts even back then, the thing that's similar is the anger that participants have, frustration participants have over the difficult economic situation. I think the demonstrations are a clear signal that the Cuban population is more willing today to openly question the government and to complain about what they see as government malfeasance, and to make demands of the government more than they ever have been willing to do that before. Partly that's fueled by greater freedom of information as a result of the expansion of the internet and social media. But I think it also represents a loss of confidence in the government recently. Diaz-Canel, of course, succeeded Raul Castro. He's not someone who was part of the founding generation. And during these kinds of transitions, a new president really has to prove his legitimacy, if you will, by showing he can get things done, and the economy's at the top of everyone's agenda. Just since Diaz-Canel became president, Cuba has suffered a whole series of disasters. The imposition of sanctions by Trump, COVID and the economic crisis that resulted from that, the rapid inflation set off by the currency and exchange rate unification, the explosion that wrecked the Hotel Saratoga, the partial collapse of the electrical grid this year, which is what's causing these rolling blackouts, the Matanzas fire at the oil refinery, which aggravated the electrical situation, and now Hurricane Ian. It's like every couple of months, some terrible disaster hits the Cuban economy, and there's a feeling, I think, among a lot of Cubans that things just get worse and worse and worse, and the government hasn't been able to remedy the problems that it faces.
The fire that in Matanzas of the oil field, the storage facility that Bill mentioned, had tremendous environmental consequences, including not only for the air from the several days of fire burning oil, it also contaminated the water in and around Matanzas, as well as far away as Havana, and it's also affected the soil in and around Matanzas. Gretchen, you're from Matanzas. You have family there. Very, very briefly, would you like to comment on the situation in Matanzas and the government's response to it, the government of Diaz-Canel, as Bill mentioned?
Okay, so let's start by saying that so Matanzas, it's the deepest bay in Cuba. So oil tanker ships can dock in Matanzas. And then you have also one of the biggest thermoelectrics like plants in Cuba. And so these, there are like 8 big tankers of these, and 4 of them exploded. Basically, it was a lightning bolt. We all know that. But the consequences, the environmental consequences, 100% we don't know for sure, because the government only said that the second tank that exploded had risks of oil spills into the bay, and that was contained. So we don't know for sure. What we know it's that there are consequences for the air quality in Matanzas, like diseases, chronic diseases like asthma. People are seeing an increased number of like asthma crisis worsen than before. We are also seeing that right after the fires, it was raining like black oil droplets into, and that's also contaminated, that, as you mentioned, Meg, the land, like the soil. It's contaminating the soil. I mean, my family and people were mentioning that they saw this like black residue after a fight all over the city, and especially the neighborhood of Versailles, which is the one next to the super tankers. And we don't know for sure. What we know is that in January 9th, 2017, the US and Cuba government signed one of the MOUs of the 23 on cooperation agreements, and specifically the response to pollution by spills of hydrocarbons in the Gulf of Mexico and the Strait of Florida. And that would have been an excellent point to basically get closer together, the two governments, and talk about and reach an agreement on something that benefits us, or basically endangers both the Cuba and also basically Florida. And regarding that now, I'm sorry, at the end of August, we saw on August 26, the Ministry of Foreign Relations of Cuba was tweeting on basically US-Cuban specialists exchanging on restoration and rehabilitation of environmental on environmental tax related with the Matanzas sinister. We don't know much about the or at least I don't know, I don't have much information on that basic, more than they were talking, and we don't know exactly what was reached from there. Basically, there are a lot of things that we don't know from the Matanzas sinister, especially with regards to the environmental contamination. I wish an independent set of specialists could assess the level of damages, but for sure there are damages there. Meg.
Thank you, Gretchen. Bill, do you have a question?
Let me ask. Yes, I was just unmuting myself there. So Meg, I want to ask you, and Gretchen can comment on this too, about Cuba's new family code. It was just a couple of weeks ago that the Cubans approved a new family code that provides new rights to the LGBTQ plus community, to women and children, obligations for families, seen, I think, as one of the more progressive oriented family codes in the region. So if you could tell us sort of what are the key elements of the code, how did it come about, and then talk a little bit about the politics of it, because there was really active engagement of a lot of people in the religious community who were opposed to it.
Thank you, Bill. On September 25th, as you suggested, there was a referendum in Cuba that occurred in the midst of the early rains precipitated by Hurricane Ian, which it is thought there were about 1,000 people who were eligible to go and vote who did not go and vote. Obviously, the weather conditions had something to do with it, but also there is speculation that there were people who, for various reasons, decided not to vote. The referendum had approximately 74% participation of those eligible to vote, which was actually the lowest of any referendum held in Cuba since the 1960s. However, there was strong support for the family code. Approximately 67% of those who voted voted yes for the family code, which constitutes 100 pages and is essentially an amendment to the 2019 Constitution. 33% voted no, and there were about 5% null or void votes that were not counted, obviously, for the yes and no part of it. The criticisms emerged not only from religious groups. During the course of 46,000 town hall meetings throughout the island over the past 3 to 4 years, there were grassroots discussions of the various proposals for the family code. And so it was discussed very widely, as a matter of fact. And during the course of those discussions, several groups or several areas of criticism emerged. From the LGBTQ communities, there was an argument made that the elements of the family code were basically a discussion of rights, women, children, gays, trans, etc. And therefore they were inherent in all people and did not need to be codified in law, etc. There are others who criticized it as being an amendment to the Constitution, whereas they felt it should be basically a package of legal requirements passed by the National Assembly. And then there were the religious groups that were highly critical, including not only the Catholic Church and all of the bishops within Cuba, but also, for example, the Baptist Church, which is strong over in the eastern part of the island around Guantanamo province, etc. The Catholic bishops issued a pastoral letter shortly before the referendum, which I mentioned was on September 25th. And they did have some positive things to say about it. They felt that the treatment or the criminalization of violence, particularly against women, but generally within families, was a very good idea. They also praised the elements of the family code, which dealt with the care of the elderly, the disabled, and the vulnerable. And in addition to that, the statement that the provision of food and care for the disadvantaged was a not only government responsibility, but also a societal responsibility, so that the bishops came out as strongly supportive of those elements. In terms of the criticisms, not only the Catholic Church, but several of the Protestant churches, the Baptists, Presbyterians, Methodists, Episcopalians, as well as evangelical groups, evangelical wings of those mainline Protestant groups, but also the indigenous evangelicals in Cuba, Los Pinos Nuevos, the New Pines, were highly critical of such elements as what was the approval of same-sex marriage, same-sex adoption, surrogacy in terms of women bearing children that they then have to give up, some elements of fertility science, for example, the freezing of a parent's, particularly the male's sperm, which was subsequently used after that individual's death to impregnate a woman, etc., which they felt, the religious groups that criticized that felt that introducing a child into a non-two-parent male and female family was not something that they could support. They also had some criticisms of the feeling that emphasis on what they called gender identity in the schools would tend to reduce the influence of parents and the nuclear family on the developing identity of children. And they were particularly strong on that. They were also critical of allowing minors to make decisions in terms of their gender identity, and particularly if it involved medical transformations, if you will. So there was a whole list of the traditional criticisms that resulted in criticisms not only by religious groups, but also by the groups, as I mentioned, within the LBGT communities that felt by including it as an amendment to the Constitution and essentially codifying it legally, that was a ignoring of the fact that such rights, same-sex marriage, for example, same-sex adoption, was an inherent right of every individual Cuban. And so that was a very interesting, just a few comments in terms of the politics. Fewer people, approximately 74% of the eligible voters in Cuba came out to vote. Now, I mentioned the serious weather conditions, but also there have been some interpretations that there are people who are quite disaffected from any governmental interference in the family grouping, in the predominance of men in terms of women within the family, as well as the children and things of that nature. So that the discussion is ongoing. The code was approved. It was approved by 66%, 67% of the voters. 33% voted no. There are some who have added the 33% who voted no to the 26% who were eligible to vote but did not vote, and said, well, this is over 50%, so therefore, or it's around 50%, therefore there was a expression of rejection, not only of the code itself, but also of this process of a referendum.
Yeah,
So,
I know that some of the opposition groups based in Miami were using social media to campaign to get people to vote no as a vote against the government. Gretchen, do you have anything to add on the family code?
Yeah, regarding the criticism to the code, I saw two trends. People saying that this was a debt to the LGBTQ community from the 1960s UMAP and all the treatment that the LGBTQ plus community suffered in the early 60s in Cuba. And another trend of people saying that this was from like anti-government activists saying that this was basically the Cuban government trying to distract the attention from the other crisis in the island to the family code, and basically seeing that as trying to improve the Cuban government image on human rights. And maybe we can talk about that later when we respond to the question on the Q&A regarding that. Well, but basically on a good note, or trying to finish this topic, this theme on a good note, in early October, we saw the first same-sex marriage after the approval of the family code in grandma. It was a couple of male who got married after 18 years of relationship.
Thank you, Gretchen. Bill?
So I think it's,
You're supposed to ask Phil something.
I am, you're right.
Gotcha.
So, yeah, so we're going to turn to foreign policy for a bit here. When Russia invaded Ukraine, the United Nations General Assembly had a vote to condemn that, and Cuba abstained on that vote. Cuba's position has been really to try to, in an odd sense, stay neutral between the two countries because it had very close relations with both. Cuba's called for a diplomatic solution and criticized Europe and the United States for provoking Russia by NATO expansion. So, Phil, can you give us a little bit of a explanation of how it is, why it is that Cuba's taken these positions, and whether or not, as the world seems to be polarizing into two superpowers and the third world, very much like the Cold War, has Cuba's position on the invasion of Ukraine harmed its relations, particularly with the Europeans and the United States?
Thanks for the question and the introduction there, Bill. Because I think many Americans are unaware of how the rest of the world actually sees this. Our press has been very jingoistic about this conflict. Let's start with Cuba's position. You summarized it, I think, very well. I'll read to you their official position. It's impossible to make a rigorous and honest examination of the current situation in Ukraine without carefully assessing the Russian Federation's just demands of the United States and NATO, and the factors that have led to the use of force and non-observance of legal principles and international norms, which Cuba strongly supports, and are particularly for small countries an essential source in resisting hegemony. Cuba is a country that defends international law and is committed to the Charter of the United Nations. We deeply regret the loss of civilian lives in Ukraine. But ignoring the well-founded claims made by the Russian Federation concerning security guarantees for decades and assuming that Russia would remain defenseless in the face of a direct threat to its national security was a mistake. Russia has the right to defend itself. Peace cannot be achieved by mounting sieges or encircling states. But in short, the Cubans found themselves in a difficult position, much like the position they found themselves in 1968 when the Soviet Union went into Czechoslovakia to suppress the revolution there at that time against the communist regime. Cuba, as a small country next to a very large power that has often tried to intervene in Cuba, seeks protection from international law by defending sovereignty of other countries. So how can it defend the Russian invasion of Ukraine or the Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia? In 1968, Fidel Castro said the invasion of Czechoslovakia was against international law. It was a crime, he said. Make no mistake about it. Many people, some historians, ignore the fact that Cuba took that position. They say Cuba caved in and supported the Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia. He didn't. Castro took a stance that said, well, this was illegal, but it was justified for the support of international revolution. And he was throwing down the gauntlet to the Soviet Union to actually, at that point, support to a greater extent the Palestinians and also the Vietnamese. In this situation, the Cubans find themselves, as Bill correctly says, having good relations with both the Ukrainians and the Russians, but in particular, they need the Russians, especially in light of the fact that the United States has not lifted most of the sanctions that President Trump imposed. Cuba has very few alternatives. It is a small country. It needs resources that Russia can provide and that China can provide. And so it tried to find a middle way, calling for diplomacy and essentially recognizing that Russia felt aggrieved by the actions that the United States had taken in terms of supporting a Ukrainian movement towards the rest of Europe. Let me emphasize that the Cuba's position is not such that of an outlier for the rest of the world. This is not costed support in the rest of the world. If you take a look at the votes on that first UN resolution in the General Assembly, Cuba did not vote with the Soviet Union, it abstained. And there were several other countries that abstained on that vote as well, countries like India. There were several countries like Vietnam that voted with Russia, but other countries voted to abstain. Columbia University economist Jeffrey Sachs, in an interview last week, made a very key point. He said the United States, Americans in general, are unaware that the rest of the world does not see this in Cold War terms. It does see the United States as having acted somewhat aggressively towards Russia and threatening Russia. Now, it's hard to say this on a day after the horrendous bombing that President Putin launched against civilians in Ukraine, but the way out of this situation, I think, is the way that Cuba is trying to point to it, which is by having negotiations, diplomacy, trying to understand the other side's motives rather than simply using force. And to that extent, I think Cuba would be supported by much of the rest of the world.
Phil, let's stay on foreign affairs for a bit longer. Last week, the new Colombian government announced it would begin negotiations to end fighting with the National Liberation Army, better known as the ELN, with Cuba and two other countries acting as facilitators. This is a resumption of a role that Cuba played when the Colombian government negotiated with representatives of the FARC, which was the largest of the guerrilla armies that had been fighting the Colombian government for decades. So how do you interpret this role for Cuba? And what is the significance of Cuba taking this role? And might there be any effect on Cuba's inclusion in the list of state sponsors of terrorism, which has sometimes been suggested?
I assume you mean the removal of Cuba from the list of state sponsors of terrorism.
Yes, the removal.
So this is hardly unprecedented. Cuba has involved itself as a mediator for decades, starting back in the war between Ethiopia and Somalia in the 1970s, as Bill has written about. Cuba tried to find a way of ending that conflict through mediation, failed, and then sent troops to support Ethiopia, but its first inclination was to be a mediator. It played a decisive role in ending the conflict between the FARC and Colombia. Much to the appreciation of President Santos, who in some ways was one of the reasons he endorsed Cuba becoming Cuba's participation in the Summit of the Americas was because of Cuba's decisive role as mediator between the FARC and Colombia. Those talks are about to break down when Cuba's efforts really saved the day. Cuba was seen as an honest broker by both sides, and that was very important. And it could play that role again, if and it could even play that role in the case of Venezuela, if the Venezuelans asked Cuba to do this, and the United States would accept Cuba as an honest broker there. So it's not unprecedented. This is a role that Cuba has taken before, but I must say I doubt that it's going to have an impact on the Biden administration. The Biden administration has had several opportunities to improve relations with Cuba. Bill LeoGrande wrote a terrific piece about 2 weeks ago, suggesting that the fire in Matanzas, the Hurricane Ian, was a great opportunity for the United States to provide aid to Cuba as a way of improving the relationship. And they haven't much listened to that. Understand that the list of state sponsors of terrorism was created in 1978, and Cuba was put on the list in 1982 as a result of Cuba's support for the Nicaraguan government, which we considered illegitimate, and the United States did, and for supporting the guerrillas in El Salvador. It remained on the list, and the list at one point had as many as 7 countries on it, but I would note to you that Afghanistan was never on the list. And countries have been taken off the list. North Korea was taken off the list, for example, when the United States sought to have improved relations with North Korea. Cuba was removed from the list, and there was very little basis for Cuba being on the list once the wars in Central America were over, and Cuba had stopped its so-called export of revolution. But the United States found spurious reasons to keep Cuba on. And one rationale for keeping Cuba on is that it harbors terrorists like the ELN. Well, in fact, that's at the encouragement of the Colombian government. So it's one of the reasons Cuba is considered an honest broker, that essentially ELN and FARC fighters had a kind of rest and recreation in Cuba. And not all of them were terrorists, to be sure. And so the claims that Cuba should be taken off the list led to President Obama removing Cuba from the list. And then President Trump, 2 weeks before he left office, putting Cuba back on the list with no basis at all, no real justification. And so, yes, President Biden could use this as an opportunity to take Cuba off the list. Arturo Lopez Levy asked a good question in the question Q&A. He said, would the passage of the family code provide a basis for seeing Cuba as less of a human rights violator? Yes, that would be another reason to take Cuba off the list, but we'll talk later about why President Biden is not doing so. So let's move from that to the current state of US-Cuban relations. Can you give us some sense of where things stand?
Well, that's a good segue, isn't it? So as I'm sure that everybody in this audience knows, Joe Biden, when he was running for president, promised that he would reverse Trump's sanctions against Cuba and return to a policy of engagement. And yet he did nothing for a year and a half, stalling basically for domestic political reasons, because the Democrats lost badly in Florida in 2020. And, it's the same old problem that Democrats have faced for a long time, of thinking that they're going to hurt themselves in Florida if they do anything positive with regard to Cuba. Then the demonstrations in Cuba on July 11 made it even harder politically to do anything positive, because the Republicans, of course, would accuse Biden of being soft on Cuba and rescuing the regime, you know, which the demonstrations made some people think the regime was about to fall. And things stayed unchanged, really, and probably would have been unchanged to this day if it hadn't been for the Summit of the Americas. But in May 2022, a number of Latin American presidents, most importantly, AMLO in Mexico, threatened to boycott the summit if Cuba, Nicaragua, and Venezuela were not invited. And ultimately, those three countries were not invited, and AMLO and some other presidents refused to attend the summit as a result. But Biden did try to give AMLO some enticement to attend, and he took three measures on Cuba. He restored people-to-people travel, which is the largest category of travel historically for non-Cuban Americans. He lifted the limitations that Trump had put on remittances, and he promised to reopen fully the consular section of the embassy in order to restore safe and legal migration. The problem is that those are all good things, but the administration hasn't done any of the necessary implementing actions. And so these policy changes have really had no practical effect. So for example, you can travel now to Cuba on a people-to-people educational license, but you can't stay in any of the major hotels because they are all owned in part or in whole by the government, and that's prohibited. The result is that no large travel agents are booking hotels or booking trips to Cuba because the size of the groups that they take are too large to stay in B&Bs. You can now send unlimited remittances to Cuba, but Western Union still doesn't have a license, nor does anybody else, to restore wire service remittances to the island. So Cuban Americans still have to have someone carry the remittances down there personally, or use other roundabout ways that are just not practical for most people. Consular services are going to reopen, but not until next year. And the migration crisis is right now. Now, most recently, as Phil was just mentioning, the United States decided not to provide material humanitarian assistance to help extinguish the fire at Matanzas oil depot. The two governments are at least talking more than they were last year. So migration talks resumed last year after, actually, I think it was maybe even earlier this year. It was in April of this year, after Trump had suspended them. There have been some discussions about whether the United States might provide some assistance in the aftermath of Hurricane Ian, but it hasn't done it yet. There are some hints that Western Union may be allowed to resume remittances, but nothing's happened yet. And there's even some hints that that the United States might reconsider Cuba's designation as a state sponsor of terrorism. I think the Cuban response to this has just been enormous frustration at Biden failing to keep his campaign promises. They see Biden as really committed to regime change, which is why they think he's keeping most of Trump's policies in place, either in reality or at least de facto. So, but I will say that the Cuban government has continued to express a willingness to engage in dialogue, to try to improve relations. Just very recently at the General Assembly at the United Nations, Foreign Minister Bruno Rodriguez said that Cuba was open to negotiating with the United States, and after all, we're neighbors and they would have to.
Let me emphasize the importance of talking. One of the things that happened during the Obama administration is that the United States and Cuba began to talk again to one another. During the Trump administration, as Gretchen mentioned, there were 23 memoranda. During the Obama administration, there were 23 memoranda of understanding signed, and those are still in effect, but they all require high-level discussions in order to be implemented. And most of those, I'd say all of them, are things that benefit the United States, things like disaster protection, disaster warning, working together to stop drug trafficking. And so talking actually is essential and could benefit the United States. I would add to what Bill said about the migration talks in April. I think they were, and to remind him that he actually wrote about this, that they were stimulated by the large numbers of migrants coming. And so it seemed very evident to the Biden administration they needed to deal with that problem. What was positive was that they added on to the changes by allowing people-to-people exchange and remittances, even though they haven't followed through in making those happen. But because the 23 memorandum of understanding still exist and have a possibility of improving relations and benefiting the United States as well as Cuba, I think that the fact that the two sides are talking, Cuba in April asked that the talks be widened to include other topics than migration, and the United States refused to do that. But there be talks again likely in December. They're supposed to meet every 6 months, talk about migration, and it's conceivable that in December they will in fact widen the talks to include some of the other topics that are included in the Miranda.
Thank you, Phil. I think we're reached the point that's already been broached, is what Bill, Phil, Gretchen, and myself think are the chances that Biden will do something to improve relations after the midterm elections. So let's expand the comments that Phil and Bill just made.
Why don't you
Well,
start, Meg?
Yeah, Phil, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, why don't you start, Meg? It's your own view.
I am of the opinion, based in part of conversations with people in the Biden administration, that it's unlikely that major accords will be reached before a second Biden term, if there is a second Biden term. There are many ifs, obviously. Will Biden run again? Will he get the nomination? And will he win the 2024 presidential election? If Trump runs and wins, then I don't think there's very much likelihood of improved relations between Cuba and the US.
Or DeSantis, for that matter.
Yes. I mean, Bill has, and Peter Kornblow have a terrific book called Back Channel to Havana.
Cuba.
If I've got that right, if my memory serves, who knows today, but it detailed and documented the many attempts at discussions between the Cuban and US governments going back to, I think the earliest date would have been 1961. Is that correct, Bill? And all the way up to go ahead.
Yeah, and there were even some during Eisenhower among a segment of the State Department that didn't want the relationship to deteriorate and engage in a variety of negotiations as well.
Yeah.
I think what you're hearing, Meg, is right. It matches more or less what I'm hearing. They're not going to make a major change in the policy, partly for political reasons, also partly, because Joe Biden has framed his foreign policy as this epic struggle between democracy and authoritarianism, and he classifies Cuba as authoritarian, and I think tends to see the world through Cold War eyes, through a Cold War prism, if you will. I mean, he came of political age during the Cold War. Now Russia once again is one of our major adversaries on the global stage, and Cuba is not the same kind of strategic partner with Russia that it was with the Soviet Union, but they still have a close relationship. So I don't see any chance of a return to Obama's policy, frankly. I think we might see some improvements in the relationship around issues that also benefit the United States, right? And that will be the rationale for them, that they're in the national interest of the United States. We could see possibly taking Cuba off the terrorism list, because it's such an embarrassment for the United States to have Cuba on the terrorism list at this point. And the one rationale Trump had for putting Cuba on the list was Cuba refusing to extradite the ELN negotiators back to Colombia at President Uribe's request when the negotiations broke down. Now, President Petro has resumed the negotiations and has thanked Cuba for hosting them, and has said that it's an injustice that Cuba is on the state-sponsored list and ought to come off. So that really gives the administration an opening to do the sensible thing about that. I think it's notable that no one in the administration wants to actually defend that designation in public, because it's so ludicrous. Whether we might see some additional action around travel and remittances, I think remittances more likely than travel, because generally Cuban Americans support the sending of remittances, and being able to do that easily instead of paying extortionate rates to so-called mules that carry money down there as a business. But beyond that, maybe some additional action on some of those bilateral accords around things like environment and narcotics trafficking that are so obviously in the U.S. interest, but not much more than that, I'm afraid.
Okay, Gretchen, what is your prediction?
Meg, I have no much to say. Then it's a real disappointment, and I feel so sorry for my compatriots that have to go through all of this. And I don't see any light at the end of the tunnel. I see more sanctions, and I see a Biden administration that it's only heating up everything possible to inflict a regime change, and something that will be completely unorganic.
Okay. Before we go to questions from the audience, Phil, do you have a few final comments before you respond to questions?
Well, let's respond to questions. That's fine.
Okay. If you wish to pose a question, please put it in the Q&A or the chat room. We're going to look at the questions in the Q&A function, and then we'll look at the questions in the chat function. And you can address them to a specific member of the panel, or to all of them, or to just two of them. Okay, it's up to you. So I have to go in and I'm hoping you're going to help me to gather together the questions. Well, Arturo Lopez Levy, a Cuban who's a professor in San Francisco, I believe, and there has a question for the entire panel. Do you think, and it's already been mentioned, do you think that the Biden administration will frame the discussion and approval of the Family Code as a human rights issue in Cuba? Who would like to attack that one or jump in?
So I think the answer is no. I don't think they have had anything to say about the Family Code so far, and I don't suspect that they will.
Okay. Phil?
Well, I mentioned it before. I doubt that they would. Everything is measured in terms of the midterm elections right now. And even though I think that they're making a very big mistake in the way they dealt with Florida, they think that appealing to the most conservative elements will get them votes or not lose them votes. And I doubt that they say that same-sex marriage, even though that is something that might even be taken up by the Supreme Court now, that they would even want to sound like they're endorsing it.
After the 2020 presidential election, the House Democratic Caucus commissioned a survey of Cuban Americans, whom they were somewhat surprised had not supported in the majority Biden's candidacy. And the survey suggested that the decision on the part of Cuban Americans to not support the Democratic candidate was on the basis of their sense that during the Trump administration, the economy in the US had improved, contrary to the Democrats' position that the improvement in the US economy had been prepared for by the Biden, not the Biden, but the Obama administration. So it's interesting to see that where the Cuban Americans are considered to be a likely support of Democrats, they are not always, quite clearly. And I think that's going to factor into the midterm elections as well as in the 2024 presidential elections. Gabrielle Vignoli from the New School. He's mentioned 200,000 Cubans reached the US in fiscal year 2022. Is there any idea of how many Cubans left Cuba in total, directly or towards the US and elsewhere in the same period? Is the figure of 400,000 Cubans having left Cuba reliable? Are there any reliable sources at all? And thank you. From Gabrielle Vignoli. Who would like to?
So I think 400,000 is high. Most people who are, and Gretchen probably should comment on this as well. Most Cubans want to come to the United States. And so I think the majority of people who are leaving are coming to the United States. The number that I've heard of Cubans going to other places in Latin America, and particularly to Spain, now that the Spanish government has passed a law of a right of return for Cubans with some recent Spanish ancestors, is about 100,000 in total. But I don't know of anybody who's actually gone from one government to the next trying to collect data on this and come up with something reliable.
I would agree with Bill. And that 100,000 is a total over several years, not just this past year. The flood of Cubans going to Spain, I think, has now been reduced because the Spanish economy isn't that great, and those who wanted to go went. So I think, there are some other countries Cubans have gone to, particularly Spanish-speaking countries, but 400,000 does seem much too high. Gretchen, do you have any comments about this?
For sure, what the number we have is the 200,000 plus of Cubans just in the last 12 months. Beyond that, we know that exactly Spain is a hotspot of Cubans, and all over. I have people who have gone to Chile or to anywhere, and from there they try to make a living there, or they just decide to migrate to the US.
Let's move on to the next question from Antonio Mendez from the Dominican Republic. And let's see, I'm pulling it up. It's a long question, so I have to pull it up. One of the most important issues facing Latin America today is Cuba. My question is as follows. Who is leaving Cuba today? In the 1980s, we noticed that the people leaving the Dominican Republic were mostly members of the middle class, as they were able to get the money needed to pay for all of the expenses migration entails. This left a Dominican Republic extremely polarized, having a lot of poor people who were not able to have the country as they could leave the country rather, as they did not as they wanted. The Dominican, how is the increase in migration affecting Cuban society at large? I'm going to take a swing at this and then turn it over to my fellow panelists. And that is what's interesting about the various periods of high migration, the 1960s, particularly up to 1967, the period 1980, the Marielitos, the early 90s, and particularly 1994, the Balseros, leaving Cuba because of the economic crises after the end of Soviet economic aid, and now more recently, again, for many of the issues that have already been mentioned, particularly socioeconomic, again, the upsurge. One of the interesting elements of the more recent migration is the fact that in the past, migrants from Cuba frequently were the males, whether they were single or whether they were the male members of a particular family. Women migrants are increasing, including the ones that do go to Central America and then attempt to cross the Darien Gap. Women are not obviously the majority today, but more women and children are leaving Cuba and attempting to get to the United States. The other factor is that the average age of the migrants is between 25 and 45 years old, although that's not an absolute, but a very substantial proportion of the migrants fall within that age group. And this causes demographic problems. The fact that the individuals are leaving who are largely those who constitute the labor force in Cuba, where increasingly a high percentage, reaching about half the population, 50%, are 60 or older, creates a demographic problem where the labor force and therefore productivity, therefore government income, et cetera, is increasingly limited by the loss of workers, and particularly highly educated workers, individuals with technical degrees, with university degrees, et cetera. And the upshot is that there is less money being generated within the country that can provide social services for the elderly and for the public health system, et cetera, and other social services. So I now turn it over to Phil and Bill and Gretchen.
So let me note that one of the differences between the Marielitos and the Balseros than the earlier period of migration, as Susan Eckstein has pointed out in her work, was that there was an increased number of Afro-Cubans who were migrating, not a majority. It went from about 5% to about 12%, but nonetheless an increase. But as Gretchen well pointed out, it's now very expensive for someone to go. And basically the route for poor Cubans who tend to be Afro-Cubans is to go by raft, and the Coast Guard is picking up those people and returning them to Cuba. Whereas at one time they were picked up and brought to the United States. And so the migrants have, by and large, they tend to be whiter than they were during the period of the Balseros and the Marielitos. And that's partly because during the last 25 years, Afro-Cubans lost economically. The money that flowed to Cuba in remittances came from the population in the United States, which was Cuban American population, which was much wider than the average Cuban population, and so blacks in Cuba did not benefit as much from remittances, for example, or from getting jobs in the tourist industry. And so there was growing inequality in Cuba. Hope Bastian and pointed this out in a book about everyday adjustments in Cuba, we're finding that what's left in Cuba, people who are left tend to be poorer, and it actually creates a demographic problem in terms of a boiling cauldron, because they're suffering even more.
Bill?
I'm going to defer to Gretchen on this one.
Okay. Gretchen?
Okay, so in terms of generation, I'm seeing a varied migration. I'm seeing younger generations as young as 2 years old, babies, 3 years old, reaching the US-Mexico border. I'm seeing elder Cubans going through Nicaragua to the US-Mexican border and coming with their families. Many of those elder people are coming with like a nuclear family, the daughter or son, and the rest of the family. But I would say that for sure it's a set of Cubans that have some money, something to sell, to pay for all of this journey. But I'm seeing also the middle high class of Cubans, the ones who had a living, a decent way of live during the 2016, entrepreneurs who had restaurants in Cuba, who had like a well-established life in Cuba, coming to the US, buying goods and going back to Cuba and improving their business. I'm seeing those people who, luckily, many of them have a tourist visa, staying in the US, and many times leaving all decades of life of investment in Cuba, because at this point there is no restaurant that you can sell in Cuba. You can sell your small house, your small car, and get that money to come here, but you are not selling businesses because everything is shut down and nobody is doing anything with that. So I'm seeing all of that, and at the same time, those people who don't have anything to spare to sell and get that hard currency, and are also reaching to family members, to relatives, and asking for that money, borrowing money just to come to the US, and hoping that in the US, working hard, they can pay the debt back.
Thank you, Gretchen. We have a question from Harold Cardenas Lema, who's from Cuba, and who also has a degree from the School of International and Public Affairs at Columbia, etc.
He edits Joven Cuba.
And oh yes, good point, Phil. He's also one of the founders of Joven Cuba, a very influential social media operation, originally aimed at younger people, high school, university, but it's now used by people of all ages in Cuba. So Harold asks, Cuban migrants mostly arrived to Florida, an environment politically radicalized to the far right of the Republican Party. Is the Democratic Party and the Biden administration aware that the current policy of the US government that actually benefits Republicans and manufacturers radicalizes individuals in the US? I'm going to throw this to Bill.
Well, I don't know. I mean, I think Harold is exactly right about the dynamic. I mean, we have seen in recent years that newly arrived Cubans in Miami have been moving to the right, partly as a consequence of just the milieu of Miami generally, which has been moving to the right, and I think importantly, the influence of social media. It used to be that more recent arrivals from Cuba tended to be more moderate in their political views, but in the last couple of opinion polls that we've seen, that trend has been reversed. I think the problem Democrats have with Florida is that they were so traumatized by the 2000 election, in which just a handful of votes would have made the difference, and the massive Cuban American vote against Al Gore because Bill Clinton sent Elian Gonzalez back to his father in Cuba, that Democrats have just been gun shy about Florida politics ever since then. And Obama had the courage to actually appeal to the more moderate progressive segment of the Cuban American community, and through his leadership was able to assemble a majority coalition of Cuban Americans in favor of his policy of engagement. Now, it was a narrow minority, but it was a majority, but it was a majority. Then Donald Trump came to office, took a hard line, and sort of swung the pendulum back, if you will, through his leadership, as antagonistic and poisonous as it was. So, Democrats hope against hope that somehow they're going to win back at least enough Cuban American votes to carry Florida, but they refuse to follow Obama's example. So I don't think that they have really a snowball's chance of accomplishing that.
I would add that last year, when Cuba was suffering enormously because of the loss of tourism and COVID, the Biden administration was thoroughly inhumane in the way it dealt with Cuba. It would have been easy for the president to relax the sanctions with respect to remittances. Cuban Americans wanted to be able to do that. He would not have lost votes in the Cuban American community. He would have gained votes had he allowed Cubans to help their families who were suffering terribly during the pandemic last year. And he didn't do so. It was a callous, inhumane policy based on a wrong assumption about what the impact of these decisions might be on the vote. And it's hard to imagine that they understand the Florida mentality very much at all.
Gretchen, what do you think?
I don't have much to say, Meg, but yes, I've seen a high amount of recent arrivals Cubans who are falling in the hands of the Republican Party and or the Republican talking points.
Okay, well, final question is from Gabrielle Vignoli, who comments hyperinflation is one of the most critical challenges the country is facing in the short to medium term period. We're talking about Cuba, I presume. How are the Cubans making sense of it? Are they thinking of money in its tripartite function of means of exchange, store of value, and unit of account in different ways than prior to the Tarea Ordenamiento of January 2021? How long do you foresee inflation remaining critical in Cuba? I have heard from Cuban economists timeframes ranging from 4 to 10 years, of course, based on a multiplicity of internal and external factors. Okay, Bill.
So
I will persecute you.
4 to 10 years seems too long to me. I mean, I can't imagine that you're going to see the kind of inflation that we're seeing today for the next 4 to 10 years. As I said earlier, I think there's a number of things that the government can do now that will produce some results in the medium term, beginning maybe next year and into the year after that, to bring this down. But I mean, the critical things that have to happen is that the domestic economy has to become more productive so that it can succeed in the stated policy of import substitution, so that it has hard currency, and so that the actual value of goods being produced closes the fiscal gap in the amount of money that the government is putting into circulation. And as I said, it's that fiscal deficit is extreme right now, partly because of COVID, actually largely because of COVID. So I don't expect that fiscal deficit is going to continue to be as bad over the next couple of years. I think that the remittances will gradually increase. I think that the tourist industry will continue to revive, although it's reviving slower than some of the other Caribbean tourist economies, but it has been growing pretty dramatically from last year, still only about a third the number of visitors as the year before the pandemic. So, if the government can really take some decisive actions on raising domestic productivity, controlling the fiscal deficit, they could begin to bring this inflation under control, in the next couple of years, I would say.
So the government is also trying to do some things in terms of licensing small and medium enterprises, they're called. And every week is issuing several tens of new licenses, tens of to hundreds of new licenses. The problem there is that though several of those enterprises are not producing things that generate new wealth, and they're not producing things that are providing for the import substitution. So the key for Cuba is being able to feed itself. 70% for an agrarian economy, a country that has agricultural capability, is surrounded by fish in its waters, and yet prefers to eat pork and chicken. This is crazy, and the government isn't taking a leadership role in that. Another factor is foreign investment. One of the things that we didn't talk about is that the Trump administration changed the Helms-Burton law to some extent. This is a 1996 law that had a waiver provision in it, which was the law said that Cubans who lost property, or Americans who lost property, and that property is being used by a foreign entity, that foreign entity could be sued in a US court. An extraterritorial provision that violates some international law, but nonetheless, every president until Trump had waived that provision, and now that provision exists. It to some extent discourages foreign investment, particularly, for example, in the cruise industry. The cruise industry stands to lose up to $1 billion in suits that have been brought against it for using terminals in Cuba that had previously been owned by private American firms. And so they're wary about actually returning to Cuba with the cruise ships. That was a major way in which US citizens were able to go to Cuba. And so there are several impediments to foreign investment, but the Cuban government itself has not taken away some of its own impediments. There are still restrictions on foreign investment, the ways in which foreign investors can pay their workers, the red tape that they have to go through, still problems with foreign exchange. that the Cuban government has not made it easy for foreign investment, and so it's losing out in terms of those possibilities. So while the government is responding positively in some ways, I think there are several Cuban economists who've been very critical of the slow pace and the limits to which they've gone.
I would like to mention, since these topics have come up several times, that the Cuba program at Columbia University's website has 4 books that are relevant. One is on the Obama administration and deals with some of the pressures that were on the Obama administration to revamp the US policy towards Cuba. It's in both English and Spanish. The second book is about the Trump administration and its rollback of basically the majority of some of the the Obama steps towards resumption of relations and then the deepening of the process of normalization. There's a third book, and all of these books are in English and Spanish, by 2 Spanish legal experts on the requirements, both Cuban and international, for foreign investment in Cuba. And our last book, which was published last November, is on US-Cuban environmental cooperation, which has been very long-standing, going back decades, and builds on 7 of the 23 memorandums of understanding that were signed between Cuba and the US during the Obama administration. All of these books are in English and Spanish. All of them can be downloaded from the Cuba program website for free. So help yourselves to get more detail on all of these. And now finally, I want to thank, and I will get this right this time, Philip, who's in the top left corner, Bill, who's at the bottom left corner. Sorry, Meg. Gretchen, who's on the bottom right corner, and particularly Leigh Edmonds. And this is her first experience with the Cuba program webinar, and she needs special thanks for rising to the challenge. And I thank the audience for their attendance. And we look forward to seeing you on November 8th to see the documentary of David Guggenheim about marine ecosystems in and around Cuba, including sharks, manatees, and coral reefs. Good night.
Right. Thank you, Meg.
You're welcome.
Thanks, everyone.
Goodbye.